Up until very recently, the only film that I had seen since the start of the pandemic in the theater was Tenet. That has recently changed. Intro. Take one. How's it going, everyone? Steve here, and tonight we're going to be talking about the film A Quiet Place Part 2, directed by John Krasinski and starring Emily Blunt, Millicent Simmonds, Cillian Murphy, and many others. Proceeding where the first film left off, the Abbott family goes further into the outside world, where they soon realize that there may be more threats out there than the creatures that hunt you and will kill you if you make a sound. Even though I was super excited to see A Quiet Place Part 2, there was more than a little part of me that was very apprehensive about it as well. Let's get the most obvious one out of the way. The pandemic. Unlike so many other films that came out during 2020 and the start of 2021, A Quiet Place was released to theaters. Not on a streaming service, not on a early access deal type of thing. It was released to theaters. It was supposed to be released in the spring of 2020, I believe, but then it got pushed back by a year. They knew that this was a film that people wanted to see, and they wanted to follow up the success of A Quiet Place Part 2, and they wanted to do it in a safe way, but they knew that they had to put it into a theater. And don't get me wrong, I love going to the theater, except, COVID, germaphobe, all of that stuff. And regardless of there being a pandemic, I would have been a little bit apprehensive about seeing this film anyway, because it is a sequel to one of the best horror films in recent memory. A Quiet Place is a movie where I really don't find anything wrong with it, and I think it's one of the strongest examples of how to do horror right that we've had in recent years. And let's face it, shall we? Usually sequels suck. Just gonna say it. Usually sequels suck compared to the original film. And what I didn't know until recently was that John Krasinski, the director of the fantastic first film, was approached by the studio to make the sequel and initially didn't even want to do it. He almost turned it down. So not only did you have a sequel to a very good horror film, but you had a sequel to a very good horror film that the director didn't want to originally make. Usually the only time a sequel really works is if it was planned from the very beginning, or if the people behind it really wanted to make it. Usually when you have a sequel that was made unplanned and without the best wishes of the people involved, it ends up being way worse than the original, and usually ends up being embarrassing to the original. With all of that being said, I had absolutely nothing to worry about here. Not just because I got vaccinated and ended up going to a very almost empty showing of the film to watch it, but it was amazing. Somehow, in some way, they managed to make a sequel to one of the best horror films in recent memory and have it not top the original, but pretty closely match how good the original was. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that this is one of the best examples of a horror film sequel that actually works really, really well. Just like with the first film, we have some very good performances on screen. Emily Blunt is great as always, and pretty much everybody on screen does a very good job. But of particular note is Millicent Simmonds. She is very good in general, and she was great in the first film as well, and kind of had her breakout role with A Quiet Place. But in A Quiet Place Part 2, believe it or not, because she had a lot to do in A Quiet Place, she's actually given even more to do in A Quiet Place 2, and she shines in every single scene she is in. And I was initially skeptical about the addition of Cillian Murphy, not because I don't like Cillian Murphy. I actually really like Cillian Murphy as an actor and a performer. But I was kind of skeptical about adding a new character into the mix. But he does really well with what he's given, and his character has a good amount of backstory. You can tell they ended up getting a lot more in terms of resources that they could put into the film, because they've got an utterly fantastic opening sequence that is going to go down in history, I think, as one of the best opening sequences in a horror film ever. And they've got a bunch of really big shots of the stuff that has happened in other areas since the start of this whole takeover. But despite all of this, the forefront is always the characters. The first film was about a family unit trying to survive in these conditions. And this film, this sequel, does not lose that in any way. Even though they have all of this other stuff that they can put on this grand spectacle, it does not lose sight of what the true heart of the film is, which are the characters on screen. And I think part of the beauty of how much they were able to expand but still keep the characters at the center comes from the fact that we already know what these monsters are, or rather, what they do. They are blind, they hunt by sound, and pretty much, if they hear you, you're dead. Getting back to the opening, for example, the opening does start out very slow, and it builds this tension. And the reason why it builds this tension isn't necessarily because of the things that are happening on screen. It's more so because it starts on day one, and it shows day one of all of this happening. The first film did not show day one. It started almost a year into this thing. And you're kind of just following the family as they're, already adjusted to the world around them. And the first film shows that even with you being that adjusted, bad things can still happen. This film takes the first day, which we know is going to be a day of doom and mass hysteria, and where a lot of people are gonna freaking die, and starts it out right before it happens. And it just builds up to it. And the part of the reason why it's building up so much is because you know what's gonna happen. You're just waiting for it to happen. And even outside of this beautiful opening sequence, the film has some fantastic scares. This is a very tense film, just about as tense as the first one. One of the biggest problems with many horror movies today is that they operate on cheap jump scares. And A Quiet Place has jump scares, but the difference between A Quiet Place and one of those really shitty horror films that was made very on the cheap with no care by the studio just so they could make some money. In A Quiet Place, the jump scares are pretty much always directly related to the thing that you are supposed to be afraid of. It works particularly well in A Quiet Place because the thing you are afraid of is making a sound. If you make a sound, you're probably dead in A Quiet Place. And speaking of which, just like the first film, the sound design in this film is perfect. Absolutely perfect. And speaking of perfection, I have to admit, after a very long time of not going to the theater, which is something that I used to do on a regular basis before the pandemic, and after being not necessarily stuck inside the house, because I did go outside and go on walks and go to grocery stores when there was no one else there, while I am fully vaccinated, and while I have a lot of faith in how well the vaccine is going to do in general, and how it's probably going to help immensely in curbing the effects of the pandemic, one of the things that has been hard for me to do is get back out there, for lack of better words. I have often tried still to only go to places when no one else is going to be there. I haven't gone to very many highly populated areas recently, and I've been enjoying a lot of time by myself and with a select few other people. But I decided, you know what? I've got to branch out there. I've got to get used to the new normal way of doing things. And I've got to start getting somewhat comfortable with how the world is going to be. So I decided to go see a movie. And I find A Quiet Place Part 2 to be probably the perfect parallel to that happening. Think about it. A Quiet Place Part 2 is the follow-up to a film in which a family was pretty much staying in their home and trying to be as quiet as possible and not make any noise and not make any mistakes for a year. This past year, we've been dealing with COVID-19 and the pandemic and trying to socially distance and not get sick for well over a year. We're not out of it yet. It's not over, but we're starting to see light at the end of the tunnel. And I guess, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the first film, Well, if you haven't seen the first film, what are you doing? Go watch it, because it's fantastic. And I don't know why you're even considering watching this video if you haven't seen the first film. Go watch it. There's that light at the end of the tunnel for the family as well. And this film picks up right where they left off. And oddly enough, this is the first movie I saw, other than Tenet, because I really wanted to see Tenet and it wasn't going to be released on a streaming service before it was in theaters. This was absolutely the best possible movie I probably could have seen, not just because of how good it is, but because of the weird parallels it has to our current situation. If you feel safe doing it, and if you can find a safe way to do it, and if you're vaccinated, please get vaccinated. If you haven't, unless you're somebody who can't, what the hell are you doing? Get vaccinated. But if you are vaccinated and feel safe doing it and find a way to do it safely, this is a great film to see in the theater. See this if you can. I definitely loved A Quiet Place Part 2 a lot more than I thought I would, and I think a lot of other people will as well. But that's it for tonight. If you like this video, go ahead and hit the like button. It really helps out with the YouTube algorithm and helps people who don't know about my content but would like to see content like this find my channel more easily. And if you're new here and you want to see more of what I do, go ahead and hit the subscribe button to subscribe to my channel. And if you actually want to be notified when I post a new video, instead of just randomly finding one every great now and then, go ahead and hit the bell icon so you can be notified when I post a new video. And with that, have a good night, and I'll see you later.